so welcome to Dublin.
Oh, thank you very much.
What about this event, or I suppose what Little are trying to do with the LGFA, made you want to come over here and talk about role models and the visibility of women's sport?
Because I think it applies to all women who are working in sport. I think this idea of visibility is so important. And I think what that leads to then is increased presence in less visible roles, which is where often the real power of it is which is often where the real power lies. So I think having people who are visible, having women who are visible, and all the research that Little have done shows that is what drives attendances at women's sport. That's what drives interest in the women's game, whatever that game may be. And I think that's what then drives the money up, which means that you can invest, which means that the sport grows at a really, fantastic rate, which is what everybody wants to see.
I thought you were really interesting earlier when you were talking about your own role models growing up and how it was very much, there was a couple of different people that you saw, and it was only maybe when you actually got started into your career that you got to see people that you really related to, and that you really, and even there are people that you still work with now. I know you mentioned people like Abby Logan and how important she was. Where do you think we are now in terms of those role models? I know a lot of people look to yourself as one on the TV all the time.
It's funny because I think with role models, if you pick somebody, and it's why elite sport is so important, because you see these women achieving at a high level. But I think sometimes if that's all you do, you think, well, if I can't be an elite athlete, then what's the point? So I think when it drives engagement and it drives interest and it drives participation in the sports, that's when it's important. Because my daughters are 13 and 16, and they're not going to go into any kind of level of elite sport, but they're both active and they're both interested in playing sport at whatever level they find, and they do it socially, and they do it just to feel good, and they do it just to kind of get out and exercise. So I think that's as important as having, the kind of people being inspired to be elite athletes, is to inspire participation in sports as well. And I think the number of women that we have now who are really achieving, I think it doesn't, and I think that's why big companies get involved as well, because it doesn't just drive women to be elite athletes or to participate in sport, it also drives women in other industries as well. I think that, you see women just being unapologetically themselves and exhibiting traits that aren't necessarily traditionally seen as ladylike, and yet of course it is, because they're human beings, and we all have those kind of same drives in us.
I thought part of the conversation you guys were having earlier was really interesting around the personality that you can be when you're a broadcaster. So I do our women's football podcast here. I cover the WSL every week. I follow the Irish team, but I also do all the Premier League chat on the radio with the lads as well. And that conversation about finding your personality and who you can be, what were like the key steps that you found to finding that personality for yourself?
Yeah, I think when you're young, you're just finding your personality anyway, even all the way through your 20s, probably even into your 30s. But I think in terms of kind of finding my own sort of personality, or finding who I wanted to be on air and keeping that as close to who I actually am as possible, it was just a case of trial and error and kind of just being more and more myself. Because when you start, and you'll have found the same thing, when you start you go into presenter mode, and even like the phrases that you use or the tone of voice that you use, you suddenly listen back and you're like, I didn't know what that was. In particular when I first started out and I was working at Sky Sports News, and there was a lot of auto cue, and then you talk in that rhythm, and then people write the links in that rhythm, and then it feels really stilted and really forced until you work out, like, how would I say that conversationally? And then that was the kind of the very early starting point of that. And then it just, I think after a while you can only be yourself. After a while you can't be anything else. You just kind of, it has to come through somewhere, and that's how it works.
And one of the things we've seen from a lot of the big female English broadcasters in particular is maybe some of the treatment that they get online, or the way that people approach them. And for you, how have you always approached that element of things? Because it can be quite pervasive at times, and it might not even be towards you. You might see it directed towards one of your colleagues, or someone from a different station that's at the same level as you, and that can almost be as impactful as when it's directed towards you.
Yeah, because I didn't when I started out, there was no social media, so I didn't have that. That wasn't a thing. I mean, they would have to sit down and write an email to the channel that nobody was watching because it was a brand new channel, and so it didn't really happen, and it didn't really become a thing for me until I was older and more established and more confident. So then I was in a place where it wouldn't knock me in the same way. But now I see it, and now it's very targeted and very directed, and there seem to be campaigns, every time that a woman is working on sport or is a sportswoman, it seems to be directed. And I think I see it, and it makes me furious, but it also makes me really frustrated, because I think for young women who are starting out, you don't need to go and look at this. It's really important to be able to take criticism, but it is also important to be able to identify people who are not worth listening to, and it's a really important life skill, I think, to be able to kind of block out the noise. And I think that social media now, particularly Twitter or X, is so horrible and unpleasant, and they are coordinated campaigns. So you need to be able to put that in context and think, this isn't what reasonable people think. This isn't how the world is. If you look up and look at the world and you talk to people, that's not who they are. This is a very specific type of person doing a very specific type of behaviour that is not about you. It's all about them. And I think it's really important to be able to recognise that. And that's not to say that I don't recognise the impact that it has on women when they see it. And I'm definitely not talking about the very real threats, and I'm not talking about that side of it. But just in terms of, it's just, guys sitting in a dirty vest or using their mum's Wi-Fi, having a bitch, and what?
Yeah, exactly.
Carry on.
Well, I know I always got the great advice that if you wouldn't sit down and have a cup of tea with them, why would you take their opinion? And I think that's a good thing, if they wouldn't sit down opposite you and say everything to your face, then...
There's that other phrase as well, isn't there? If you wouldn't ask somebody for their advice, don't take their opinion. Yeah. And I think, that seems about right. And I heard that quite early on, and I thought, that's useful.
And in saying all that, like, the face of English broadcasting in particular has changed remarkably over the last 10 years, and maybe will be changing even more in the next couple of weeks. Like, that's brilliant to see, and you have former players like Izzy Christensen doing Premier League every weekend. Surely this is only just going to be more and more growth that's going to come, as much as we talk about maybe not being as far as we always hoped.
Yeah, I think it's really important for the first women to do it, like Izzy, when Karen was coming on to be a pundit as well, and all those women who did. Steph Horton's coming through now. There are lots of women who've worked on the women's side of the game who are now bringing their expertise to the men's game, and in the women's coverage as well. And that's become normal, that you cross over and you talk about the sport because you know the sport, not because you know about the difference. And sometimes actually that different perspective is really useful. So I think that it's really important that you have those trailblazers, but it's also really important that we build on that and start developing new talents. And that, it feels ridiculous to say that, because even a lot of the women who are working in the game now are still new talents, but it's important that we keep developing that. And I think it's really important as well that there is development behind the scenes as well, because I think if you have the same type of person making the decisions, you get the same outcomes, or you get a certain version of what they think people want to see. So I think that narrow band of people who are making decisions is what needs to change almost at the moment, as much as what happens in front of camera, because what's happening in front of camera is moving. That's good, and we're kind of getting there. That's already going. Now it's time to get the ball rolling behind the camera. I work with a brilliant director called Sarah Cheadle, who was the first woman to direct a host broadcaster match at the World Cup. And she did that in Qatar as well, which felt significant. So people like that, I think, are really important.
Definitely. We had a show on Sunday. We have this thing called Nullig Naman here, which is Women's Christmas, and it's traditionally a day where the women would take a break, but we did on Off the Ball a Nullig Naman show. So I presented it. Alana, who you met outside, she produced it.
Should you have been working or taking a break?
Probably taking a break, but we had like an all-female show, all behind the scenes female, which is very rare as well, and it was just a really nice collegiate sort of moment, and the discussions we had were so different to what we would normally have, and it was really fun to do. But besides that, one last one for me, just in terms of the Premier League season and how it's unravelling, and Liverpool are obviously doing brilliant. City, we don't know what's going on there. Arsenal after the weekend, don't really know what's going on there either as an Arsenal fan. But what has been your perception of the season so far?
I think it's been a really unpredictable season, even if, as you look at it, Liverpool and Arsenal are up there challenging for the title, which, might not be that unpredictable. But the fact that you've got Nottingham Forest in the mix, and there's a huge game coming up between Forest and Liverpool, or the fact that, you've got teams like Fulham and Brentford, who, especially at home for Brentford, with that game coming up at Liverpool at the weekend, the games are really unpredictable. And even with the teams at the bottom, and the promoted teams are down there in a relegation battle, but in terms of the performances, particularly Ipswich have been putting in, it feels like they're in games, and you just wonder what's going to happen with a team like that in the second half of the season. So that's what you want in an exciting season. And it's not great for City fans, but City dropping off allows other teams to come into the mix. Manchester United changing their manager in the middle of the season, they're always box office. Everybody has an opinion on them, whether you support them or not, from whatever angle. Everybody has an opinion on them. So the fact that they're a big storyline this season is really interesting, and the fact that their fans now have got that first step towards improvement, which is being competitive in those, whether it's the Liverpool game, or whether it's the City beating Manchester City, or whether it's drawing against Arsenal in the FA Cup and then going through on penalties. Suddenly those big competitive games, they've got that competitive edge back. That seems like the first step.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Kaylee. Thank you so much.
Right, thank you.